Our first week of Marvel Snap's Infinity Conquest is here. You can load up your favorite deck list and play through this mini tournament mode. And if you get 5 match wins in a row, not only will you get a plethora of medals to cash in for various prizes at the Conquest medal shop, but you'll also unlock a unique cosmetic on the avatar that you're using on the deck that you complete your Conquest run with. Today's video, we're going to be taking a look at some of the untapped.gg metrics for the Infinity Conquest to see what people have been playing to success so far that are using their tracker. Shout out to Untapped for giving me early access to this feature so we could sort through some metrics and talk about what they mean for all of y'all at home. It is worth noting this is an early feature, so there is some small minor issues such as Bounce and Spider-Ham here are both listed in A tier. That's actually the same archetype when we expand that, so those should be grouped together, and you'll see not only is that deck incredibly powerful sitting at the highest win rate, but it's also pretty popular. When we put those two groups together, it's almost 14% of the games that are logged inside of Conquest by players using this tracker. Let's go ahead and dive right into the deck list and talk about how they work and ways that we can possibly be attacking them. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the bounce deck because I've covered it in a lot of different iteration at points in the past. The main thing I want to call out when pointing out the deck lists that are being successful is this variation, which I generally refer to as my stock bounce deck, has been incredibly popular, as well as a variation that's playing a variety of tech cards. In specific, Shang-Chi as well as Iron Man are cards that people are playing inside of this deck with some consistency now. Iron Man lets this deck go really tall in a single path, letting you go over the top of a Lockjaw that's flipping a lot of power into play. And then Shang-Chi, similarly, can hack big things down to size on the opponent's side of the board. Personally, I'm partial to this first deck list because I think you have no problem going big with the tools that this one has to provide. But when you're playing into bounce decks, you should definitely be aware that things like Shang-Chi and Iron Man are inside of the output range of cards that you're going to be playing against. Most of the successful Lockjaw decks in the Conquest metrics are high evolutionary variations at this point, just because making your Wasp and your Hulk better is incredibly powerful. Whenever I'm playing into a Lockjaw deck, the things that I would consider core that I would basically always expect them to have are obviously the deck's namesake here in Lockjaw, as well as the 2 copies of Thor, and then high evolutionary with Hulk and Wasp that they're powering up, and then Chavez to add a little bit of consistency to the bottom end of the deck. The big place that there's a lot of variation in this archetype is the extra 6 drops past Chavez and Hulk. Magneto, Odin, and Doctor Doom I think are probably the most popular that you're going to see, but things like Giganto and Infinite, and even sometimes other additional 5 drops like Vision are cards that see play with some consistency inside of this deck. Jubilee is the most common 4 energy play as another cheap thing on the curve, but if a deck list is leaning into things like Infinite and Giganto, you can oftentimes see Dracula in this slot or in addition to Jubilee as well. The one thing I want to point out that this particular highlighted list is doing that I think is very good into Conquest because of the bounce decks we just talked about is I think Wave is basically a must-play card in this archetype. This deck list can leverage Wave efficiently just by waving into one of its many 6 drops, but ultimately this deck is playing Wave not to accelerate. You already have Lockjaw and Jubilee to get your big drops out ahead of time. This deck's playing Wave because Wave on turn 5 shuts the bounce deck down cold in its tracks a lot of the time, and in my experience playing this matchup from the other side, this deck is one of the ones the bounce deck has a hard time playing out on turn 5 and still beating, just because of the absolute massive numbers that you need to be playing to go over the top of what this deck is bringing to the table. So if you want to play Lockjaw and you want to have the most success with it, I would definitely recommend making Wave one of the key cards in your arsenal for this archetype. If I'm being honest, I'm actually kind of surprised the Sera deck is as popular and as successful as the untapped metrics show. I think this deck list is in kind of a rough spot. It's catching splash damage from people wanting to play Wave to beat up the bounce deck, and the addition of Spider-Ham to the format is often hitting Sera with some pork, leaving her not the powerful 5 energy play that you want to be having. That being said, this deck is just a generically good pile of tech cards. Killmonger, Shang-Chi, and Enchantress are definitely what I refer to as like pub stomper style cards, where even though there's established decks that are popular in Conquest, there's still a lot of people playing a lot of different things, so it's hard for this deck to ever be too terrible, I would say, when you're playing some of the best tech cards that Marvel Snap has to offer, in combination with things like Hitmonkey, Angela, and Kitty Pryde and Bishop that are very good at efficiently putting a bunch of stats onto the board. If you're looking for a deck list that I think probably probably struggles a little bit into the tippy top decks, but is likely good against the field. This would be my recommendation, but I think that's quite the gambit to consider when you're entering a format where you need to win 5 matches in a row to get that coveted prize. Red Skull was buffed back to 14 power in the most recent over-the-air update, putting Shuri solidly back on the map a little bit. It is worth noting that this archetype's a little bit more susceptible to Shang-Chi, since you can't hide your big Shuri thing behind a copy of Cosmo anymore. That being said, we do still have armor to protect our large lads, and this deck can win games where you don't Shuri simply by playing Red Skull's large stat line out and then either having it Sauron to remove its downside or Enchantress to wipe away that penalty after the fact. While there's a few different Shuri variations that are seeing play, this Sauron variation by the numbers has been the most successful one in Conquest so far, and honestly, I think this deck list is a pretty reasonable choice. 28 power Red Skull eloquently goes over the top of what both the Lockjaw and the Bounce deck are doing, and if you can manage to navigate your games around Shang-Chi successfully, I think this deck is quite powerful in the current metagame. If you're looking for a slightly saucier version of Shuri, this version of Kitty Pryde Shuri has been my preferred build of this archetype that I featured on the channel before. We'll actually have a new highlight with it going up early next week, showcasing Red Skull with 14 power. I would say the big draw to this build over the previous Sauron one that I showed is that the way Kitty Pryde doesn't count her own power towards priority in a given turn makes this build a lot better at playing around opposing Shang-Chi's, simply because giving up priority when you're going to be putting a big stat line thing into play is often difficult to do, but Kitty Pryde allows us to do that in a way that's incredibly powerful. This build's also leveraging Vision, which could be a fine tech card to slot into the Sauron build as well if you want to hedge matchups that are playing things like Spider-Man and Storm. Up next, we have the second of 3 different high evolutionary decks. High evolutionary control is what this one is usually referred to as. So the kind of core defining features of this build of the high evolutionary archetype is that you're leveraging Storm, Spider-Man, and Professor X to kind of win a path with a 1-2 punch. You'll play Storm on turn 3 and then follow her up with something like Cyclops, or precede her with something like Nebula or Wasp to allow you to lock up one path, and then Daredevil plus Professor X or Spider-Man will lock up a second, or you'll just slam down an absolutely massive high evolutionary powered Hulk to win the game on turn 6. I'll say the one kind of downside to this archetype is definitely the fact that it has kind of low cube equity, meaning your opponent knows when they're beat typically if they're at an all average Marvel Snap player. So while you're going to win a lot of 1 and 2 cube games with this, you should expect a lot of the matches that you're playing to go longer, because it's going to be rare that your opponent gets committed for more than 2 cubes before the high stakes rounds kick in at round 5 inside of Conquest. The final deck list in the B tier category for Infinite Conquest on Untapped currently is this one that's just titled High Evolutionary. The big thing that separates this one from the Lockjaw and Control variation that we looked at before is looking to leverage Abomination as an efficient card that it can play in the late game that gets cheaper for every minus power that's afflicted on the opponent's side of the board. There's a lot of variation in some of the details that these decks can play, but these 12 cards I think look like some of the best. Hazmat can give you a leg up at making your Abomination cheaper if your opponent's played to the board. Rogue is really important here because she turns off opposing Luke Cages that would otherwise be stopping your minus penalties from going on. And this build is leveraging Sunspot as well as Misty Knight at the bottom end of the curve to make it so soaking up energy for a big She-Hulk Abomination turn on the final turn of the game gets used really efficiently. All in all, as someone who's super plugged into Snap and has been playing a ton of Conquest personally, there wasn't anything too surprising on this tier list. I've been of the opinion for a while that Bounce was probably one of, if not the best deck in Marvel Snap, and as the Conquest look to be playing out here, that looks to be more and more likely. The deck list really has a ton of play to it, and more importantly, it's just a really high cube equity deck. A lot of people are really bad at figuring out, where you're going to be playing your cards to the board and how many stats you can put into play on the final turn, which leaves them staying inside of games that they are definitely beaten and spewing cubes that they shouldn't be spewing if they were better at counting counting out what their opponent was looking to do. I think good bounce players can also navigate around the hate cards that your opponents are playing a lot of the time. Something like Wave coming on turn 5 is actually a little bit less good in Conquest against the bounce deck, since once that's a known factor, the bounce players can start playing out proactively on turn 5 and then just slamming Chavez on turn 6. I think the kind of sleeper pick from the best decks that are listed here is definitely the Shuri deck, with that Shuri Kitty variation that I pointed out during the video being the spiciest of the best things you can be doing. I think one thing that's definitely worth noting about Conquest as a format is it's much lower variance than regular Marvel Snap is, and honestly, despite endless complaining about locations from a lot of people, Marvel Snap's already a pretty low variance card game where you get to see 75% of your deck in a given game, and this lower variance format, I think, kind of increases the gap between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to good decks versus bad decks. I don't think any decks are inherently better or worse in Conquest than they are generically, but the kind of gap between a deck that's already good and a deck that's already kind of middling gets bigger, because when you remove variance from the equation by playing multiple games, it's harder for a deck that's a little bit underpowered to get lucky that many times, especially over the course of 5 Conquest matches as you work your way towards your Infinity ticket. At any rate, I'd love to know your thoughts on what decks you've been playing in the Conquest. Does your experience on what you're playing against match up with this tier list here? Let me know in a comment down below. As always, if you enjoyed my musing on this topic, be sure to snap that like button. Hopefully, we'll see you back again real soon for a sweet deck highlight later this afternoon here on YouTube.